My name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Brain Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. Well, lately we've been doing a review of a book by a leading atheist author, Dan Barker, entitled Godless. And today we come to chapter 16, or chapter 10 in his book, in which he discusses the subject of the Bible and morality. And we'll actually probably be spending several weeks going through that chapter because obviously morality is a very, very important subject that all of us need to look at carefully. And basically, what Barker begins the chapter by complaining about what he calls the barbaric decrees in the Bible, and specifically he mentions the mention of the death penalty for breaking the Sabbath, and the passage in particular that he refers to is found in Numbers chapter 15, Numbers chapter 15, where it says, and I'm reading from the New American Standard Version. Now, while the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation, and they put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then the Lord said to Moses, "The man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp." So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. And of course, the complaint that Barker has about that is that it's an unusually severe penalty for simply gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Why would a man be put to death for that? And so therefore he winds up saying, he says, "We see no condemnation of such barbarism, no moral outcry, no denunciation by Christians of these shameful acts committed by their loving God in the good book." And then the conclusion that he draws is that Christians cannot substantiate the claim that the Bible is a good guide for modern behavior. And so then he goes on to discuss what we call the divine command theory. Now, basically what he's talking about here is a philosophical question about what exactly determines morality, what determines right and wrong. And the biblical view, the Judeo-Christian view, is what's sometimes referred to as the divine command theory. In other words, things are wrong because this is what God commanded. God's the creator. He sets the rules. It's wrong to steal because God said it's wrong to steal. So we call that the divine command theory. And so basically, Barker is going to go on in this chapter, and he's going to try to attack that theory. And he says it's a humanist, and he sees himself as a humanist, looks for some reason or principle independent of authority. So in other words, he supposedly looks at the practical consequences of various forms of human behavior and says that we can decide on purely practical grounds that it's wrong to steal or wrong to commit adultery or what have you. And we don't need to have some kind of an authority, a divine authority figure telling us what's wrong and what to do. And then he goes on to criticize believers for not being willing to criticize divine authority. In other words, he says that if Christians were being reasonable, they would be able to look at the Bible and they would be able to condemn certain things that are in it, which is what he's going to go on and do in the book, starting with this commandment to stone somebody to death because he was picking up wood on the Sabbath day. So what exactly does the Bible say about this, and what's the response to that? Well, first of all, let's look at the divine command theory. God is our creator. It starts off with the premise that God is our creator, and so he's the one who sets the rules. And so therefore he's the source of morality. There's a famous passage in Micah 6:8 where it says, "He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." So in other words, it's God who sets the rules, and those are the rules that he sets down. That the reason why we should treat each other fairly, the reason why we should show compassion and concern for each other, is because, we're ultimately accountable to a supreme being who told us that that's what he wants us to do. God is our creator, so he sets the rules. And so morality is rooted ultimately in God's own character. So, for example, then you ask the question, so how does God determine what morality should be? How does he set the rules? How does he determine what the rules are? And part of it is rooted in his own character, things that he personally likes and dislikes. So, for example, if you go back to Exodus chapter 34, you have a situation where, Moses is dealing with God on Mount Sinai, and The Lord kind of reveals himself to Moses, and he passes by him, and he makes this kind of definitive statement about what God's own character is like. And he says in verses 6 and 7, then the Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren for the third and the fourth generation. And so he begins by pointing out that there are like two different aspects of God's character. One of them is that his love and compassion. It says that he's compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth. So God cares about us. He keeps his word. He provides for us, and he's even willing to forgive it, sin. But then it goes on in the next verse to talk about God's justice. It says, yeah, he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and the fourth generation. So you might say, well, isn't that a contradiction? First he says he's slow to anger and willing to forgive, and then it says that he punishes them. I think the implication there is that if people come to God and they ask for forgiveness, God will forgive them. But if they don't, why then they're going to wind up paying the penalty for their own sins. And then you wonder, but then it says he visits the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and the fourth generation. And here it has to be kept in mind that we're dealing with an Old Testament context here. The Old Testament says very, very little about the afterlife, what happens to people after they die and so on. So what he's talking about, basically the promises and conditions in the Old Testament are usually grounded in temporal benefits. So in other words, if you are faithful, God's going to bless you in the land in which you dwell. And if you're not faithful, why then you're going to suffer all kinds of hardship and suffering. And he points out that this would extend, and when you're talking about, a nation living in a physical land, then a lot of times it's going to depend, then what you do is going to have an effect and a bearing on your offspring and your children. The reason why I enjoy the health of the freedom and the prosperity of living here in America is because generations ago, my ancestors sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and settled here in here in America. And that's the only reason why I am here and not in, someplace in the jungles in Central Africa or the mountains of South America. And so that's the way it is. The decisions of the ancestors is going to have an effect on the descendants. And so that's the way it looks at it there. So then it's also so when God decides what is right and what is wrong, it's partially based on his own character. That God is a God of compassion and justice, and he wants us to be show the same kind of compassion as well. He cares about us. He wants us to care about each other, and so that's because that's the way God is himself, and that's the way he wants us to be. But then it's also partially based on the fact that on what God thinks is in our best interest as human beings. So, for example, when you go to Psalm 1, it says, now blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by the streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither, and in whatsoever he does he prospers. The wicked are not so, but they are like chaff which the wind drives away. Therefore the wicked will not stand in the judgment, nor sinners in the assembly of the righteous. For the Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the wicked will perish. So the idea here then is that that there are some things that pertain just strictly to us as human beings, as God's creatures. So, for example, Jesus said that in heaven there is no marriage or giving in marriage. The institution of marriage is something that God ordained for us as human beings, so that we could function here on earth. And so he ordained that it would be a binding commitment union between one man and one woman so that they could then produce offspring. Those children would grow up in stable two-parent families and grow up to be prosperous and functional members of society. And that's what God intended when he created us. Human sexuality was created by God for a specific reason and purpose, and that's the rationale behind it. Not same-sex, oral and anal intercourse, that kind of thing. So that is that. What does that? So then the question is, all right. So if that's the case, what exactly is it that God commands? Well, first of all, he says in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, it says, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." As we were created by God, placed here on earth, so that we would love Him and to serve Him, and that is the first and the greatest commandment. And then in Leviticus 19:18, it says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." So in other words, not only are we supposed to relate to God in a certain way by seeking after Him and loving Him and serving Him, but we also have to relate to each other. And he says we should love your neighbor as yourself. In other words, we should just be just as concerned for our neighbor's well-being as we should be for our own. And that's why we want to be a little bit careful. I know a lot of evangelical Christians in America like to think in terms of being conservative in their politics. And of course, here in America, we have a very capitalistic free market economic system. And, a lot of Christians feel that that's what a good politician should uphold. But you want to keep in mind that capitalism is based on self-interest. You're looking out for good old number one. You're pursuing what you think is in your own individual and best interest. Whereas it could be argued that we ought to be concerned about the poor, the indigent. We ought to, and sometimes people who are fleeing from oppression in other countries, and they come on our doorstep, and we should make sure that everyone has the food and clothing and shelter that they need, and we ought to be concerned about their well-being because that's what God requires. He says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," and that means you look after them, you take care of them. And Jesus went on to say in Matthew 22 that these are the two greatest commandments. In other words, he summed up the moral law with those two commandments, and that basically is what God requires of us in the way of human behavior. All right, so then what should we say here then about that passage in about stoning people to death for picking up wood on the Sabbath day? Barker's argument is that that's unduly harsh and cruel and unusual punishment. Well, you have to go back where God explains what the rationale is behind the Sabbath, and so we read it. You go back to Exodus chapter 31, and starting with verse 12, it says, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, But as for you, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, You shall surely observe my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between you and me, and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Therefore you are to observe the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. For 6 days the work may be done, but on the seventh day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath that day shall surely be put to death. So the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath, to celebrate the Sabbath throughout their generation as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, but on the seventh day he ceased from labor and was refreshed." So in other words, you have to understand what the significance of the Sabbath day was and why were the Israelites commanded to observe it. And first of all, he says that it was a sign. And here he's using the word sign in the sense of kind of like an outward expression of a formal relationship or a commitment. In other words, the idea then is that as human beings, we were created by God, and he rested on the seventh day. And so basically, the seventh day rest, the Sabbath day, is like a reminder. It's like a formal sign or indication that God is the creator and that he created us with our well-being in mind. And so then it goes on to say that and so it kind of signifies the relationship that we should have as human beings with our creator God. Then second of all, he says that the Sabbath is holy. And when he says holy, Now, this is a concept that a lot of modern secularists just have a hard time understanding. When we talk about something being holy, we're talking about it being set apart for the exclusive use of God Himself. Um, so first of all, basically it's set aside from common use and is dedicated to God Himself, and therefore it has to be treated with a special kind of dignity and respect. And it's based on the idea that there's a fundamental distinction between God and man. First of all, God is the eternal, all-powerful Creator, and we're mere creatures of the dust. So there's this infinite difference between God and ourselves. Then, second of all, we're fallen sinners. We're stained and polluted with sin. Therefore, there's a sharp distinction between God and man that must be maintained. God cannot do anything at all that would condone our sin. And because we're sinners by guilty nature, we have to approach very, very carefully. And the only reason we can have a relationship with God at all is because of Christ was willing to offer Himself up as an atonement for our sin, and that way we officially condemn the sin and make it possible for God to forgive us. So therefore, the Sabbath day is holy, and it has to be treated with a utmost respect because it's holy to God. So therefore, to perform or work on the Sabbath is to desecrate it or profane it. In other words, it boils down to an act of disrespect to God Himself. There's a certain sense in which what we're doing is, almost slapping God in the face, and that is why God can be so angry at people desecrating the Sabbath, and that is why He made that commandment. Now, it's interesting that the Sabbath is the only one of the Ten Commandments that is not repeated in the New Testament. And it could be argued that New Testament Christians are not under um, a moral obligation to maintain one particular day of the week as a day without work. And it oftentimes can be that you had people that were slaves, for example, in the New Testament, and they had no choice except to work when their employer told them to work. Um, so basically, it was a part of the civil law code of ancient Israel, and it was something that Israel, as God's chosen people, were commanded to respect. They were living in a land that God had given them, and therefore they were not to work on that land on the seventh day of the week. And so it's something that, is a strict rule in the Old Testament, isn't necessarily binding in the New Testament, although it could be argued that we are required in the New Testament to honor God with our time and our money, and that we should set aside a certain amount of time, um, both in our daily lives and even on the weekends, to worship God and to seek Him and to acknowledge Him as our Lord and Creator and to spend time with Him. And that's why it's important to worship God on a regular basis. So that is why the penalty for breaking the Sabbath was so harsh. It wasn't just simply a matter of, you're picking up a piece of lumber on a certain day of the week. Basically, it was desecrating a holy day and basically ignoring and insulting God in the process. So what it all boils down to is this. Since God is our creator, He sets the rules, and we are obligated to obey Him with all reverence and respect. And as we go through the rest of the chapter in Barker's book, we'll be examining different kinds of ethical rules and principles and seeing what exactly is it that God requires and demands of us. And I have to say this, I think that one of the problems with modern secularism and with atheism in particular is that you wind up destroying the basis for morality. If there is no God, then what determines what is right and wrong? And a lot of times, you'll find atheists complaining of certain things that they find in the Bible, especially in the early books of the Old Testament, and they turn right around and shoot themselves in the foot and say, "Well, there is no God." Okay, so if there is no God, what makes anything right or wrong? What is wrong about the things that you just complained about in the Bible? Okay, what is the basis of morality? And of course, Barker will eventually go on and try to argue his case, but we'll have to go ahead and take a look at his argument. Um, but so basically, what it all boils down to is that all of us as human beings are required by God to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with our God. And the proverbial bottom line, as it were, is that someday each and every one of us are going to have to stand before our Creator on the day of judgment and give an account for the things that we have done here in this life. And so ultimately, what is right and wrong, what is just and unjust, is something which is determined by our Creator, and we are accountable to Him, and we need to follow His rules. And once we get rid of God and we get rid of the Bible, then we've got ourselves a real problem, which is what we're seeing in Western society today. So I hope that you'll take all of that to heart, and we'll stay tuned as we continue to work our way through Barker's book and consider some of these issues in greater depth. Thanks for listening. Bye now.